Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to get straight to the point. The numbers are big. $6 trillion annually for global climate finance, an annual climate finance gap of over $4.5 trillion, with stark inequities in capital deployment. Such figures will make some despair, but we should not, because we're not talking about trillions in grants or corporate CSR. We're talking about 6 trillion of investments. We're looking at an unmet opportunity of $4.5 trillion. And the world is not short of money. There's more than $120 trillion in assets under management between pension funds and insurance, family offices, and sovereign wealth funds. Worldwide, net private wealth stands at over $450 trillion and is expected to increase more than 6% annually. We don't just have the money, we have the momentum. Barely a year ago at COP28, the UAE delivered transformative outcomes through the UAE consensus. COP29 in Azerbaijan built on these achievements, and COP30 in Brazil will continue to push the world forward. It's increasingly clear that the so-called Global South is leading the charge. China is now thought to have 1,200 gigawatts of installed wind and solar capacity, 5 years ahead of the government's target. In the first quarter of 2024, China installed more solar power generation than the rest of the world combined for the whole year. 3/4 of India's new installed power capacity last year were renewable. In fact, India is moving towards an electrified economy much faster than any nation ever has. Closer to home, the UAE will invest more than $160 billion in global clean energy in the coming years, with a focus on ensuring that these investments promote a just transition, protecting livelihoods and supporting vulnerable communities. You will have heard Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber talk about the launch of ADNOC's XRG, a groundbreaking $80 billion lower carbon energy investment company driven by 3 megatrends: the transformation of energy, exponential growth of AI, and the rise of emerging economies. And of course, as we just heard, Altera plans to invest $30 billion to generate at least $240 billion into smart climate solutions. Indeed, the world's momentum is coming from many serious companies making serious investments. And it should not surprise anybody that the Global South is stepping forward. It is a global powerhouse. It's already home to 85% of the world's population. It already accounts for more than half of global GDP. And by 2030, it's anticipated to account for more than 80% of the world's middle class. So any answer that does not put the Global South, or in other words, the global majority, at the center is no answer at all. So the world has money and momentum, and now we must seize this moment. And to do so, we need a coordinated whole-of-society approach, supported by equitable financing mechanisms that prioritize both environmental and social outcomes. And I believe that the business and philanthropy sectors, in partnership with governments, are the key to unlocking these opportunities. The private sector has always been a driver of innovation. Governments can and must enable this innovation. And philanthropy is the world's hidden catalytic capital superpower. A hint of what's possible came at COP28 during the first ever Business and Philanthropy Climate Forum. At that forum, more than 1,300 private sector leaders from 80 countries, nearly half from the Global South, and 40% of them women, joined forces to deliver $7 billion in new commitments. And I want to emphasize, these were firm commitments to invest in net zero and nature positive projects designed to deliver market returns. That forum came about because the UAE's leadership has long believed that society moves fastest when it moves as one whole society. The success of the UAE is built on this philosophy. My job as Special Envoy for Business and Philanthropy is to help identify more of these multi-stakeholder opportunities to accelerate collaborative progress. And I wholeheartedly believe that our success as a global society will depend on how well that we embrace this philosophy around the world. So again, we have the money, we have the momentum, and now we must act boldly, working across sectors and across geographies to seize this moment together. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Your Excellency, Badr Jafar, Special Envoy for Business and Philanthropy of the UAE. Hi, everyone. My name is Kyle Harrison, and I lead the environmental markets team within Bloomberg NEF. I'm based in New York. We've got a rock star panel here today to talk about mobilizing capital into the climate transition. Before we kick things off, I wanted to kind of set the stage a little bit. I don't think it's a surprise to anyone in this room. It's been a rocky few years for the sustainable finance market. On one end, right, Bloomberg NEF tracked in 2024 that $1.6 trillion in sustainable debt was issued by companies and countries around the world. That is down from a record in 2021. But on the other end of the spectrum, you saw 500% growth in transition finance, for example, and green bonds actually hit a record volume. You can also move into policy, for example. So you've got 42 markets around the world now that have either implemented or are proposing a sustainable taxonomy, so defining what green and non-green activities are existing in that market. But at the same time, you can turn to the United States, for example, where I'm based, and you've now got 20 US states that have implemented anti-ESG policies. At BNEF, what we're estimating is that for us to go ahead and achieve a well below 2 degrees Celsius trajectory of warming, we need to mobilize $116 trillion into energy supply between now and 2050. And moving forward, right, in 2030, we need, for every dollar of that goes into fossil fuels, we need $4 to go into clean energy supply, ramping up to 10-to-1 ratio in 2050. Right now, we are at less than a 1-to-1 ratio, right? So we have a lot of work to do. Today, we're going to talk about how do we get there, right? And what role does the UAE and the Middle East more broadly play in that? So I'm, again, joined by a fantastic panel. To my left, we have Kyung-Ah Park, who runs sustainable investments at Temasek. We have Mercedes Vela Monserrate, who's the Chief Executive Officer at the Global Center for Climate Finance. We have Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin, who is a UN climate envoy. And then we have Mohamed Marzooqi, who is the CEO of HSBC UAE. Whew, I'm impressed I memorized all that. So Mercedes, I want to kick things off to you, right? As we see, for example, sustainable debt markets tailing off, as you see investments into, for example, ESG ETFs also plummeting, we need to get innovative when it comes to climate finance, right? We need to unlock new mechanisms, but we also need new markets to get involved. And the UAE, in particular, is positioning itself as a hub for global climate finance. And what role does GCFC play in that?
Thank you very much. Well, the Global Climate Finance Center was launched at COP28 with two main objectives in mind. One, it's about mobilizing capital for climate action, but very importantly, to establish the UAE as a new global climate finance hub, a one-stop shop for climate business. Our journey began with a very strategic question, fundamental question, I would say, from our leadership. How do we make climate finance available, affordable, and accessible? Now, a number of key initiatives such as Alterra, that was just described by His Excellency Ambassador Majid, already answered that question. But there was a realization for the need to establish a platform that will serve as an accountability platform for some of the COP28 initiatives that were announced, while at the same time establishing the UAE into a new global climate finance hub. So concretely, the way we are promoting innovation and climate finance is by serving as the secretariat of 3 key initiatives that were launched. The first one is the Global Climate Finance Framework that was adopted by 15 countries, accounting for 40% of the global GDP. The Africa Green Investment Initiative, a 4.5 billion initiative to be deployed in Africa by 2030. And then Innovate for Climate Tech, which is about focusing on venture capital and startup. At the same time, the center will serve as a platform to provide research, advice on what constitutes fit-for-purpose regulatory frameworks to mobilize capital, and last but not least, as a platform for collaboration between the private, the public, and the philanthropic institutions.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll definitely touch more on the public and private partnerships moving forward. I wanted to kind of piggyback on you mentioned Africa, right, and emerging economies. And I think the big takeaway there is, right, every economy in the world has different challenges when it comes to the climate transition, right? And what we've started to see in some markets around the world is transition finance. For example, in markets like Japan, where you have, for example, a stubbornly cheap coal market, you can use, for example, transition bonds to move us away from coal to natural gas or renewable energy. So Kyung-Ah, I want to move over to you and get your take, both from the Temasek perspective on mobilizing this capital, but where do you see transition finance kind of playing a role in this movement?
Yeah, and thank you for having me and Temasek. And for those of you who don't know Temasek, we are a Singapore headquartered global investment firm. And because we are a generational investor, we invest today for the current generation, but also with the future generation in mind. And so sustainability is very much at the core of how we deploy capital, how we integrate it across the investment process, how we engage our portfolio companies, and manage ourselves as an institution. So we certainly invest into the innovative green solutions that we need to scale. But importantly, alongside that, how do we actually transition the incumbent gray industries, many of which actually sit within our portfolio, given that we are a shareholder and investor into companies in airlines, to ports, to energy, and so forth, but also taking targeted investments into the gray to green transition. And that is absolutely critical. And where we can, ideally, increasingly, we are trying to bring the innovative companies with incumbent companies so that the early stage companies can go to market with demand visibility, and then the incumbent companies can actually transition faster and innovate and become more resilient. So really taking a systems approach. And that is important given it is fundamentally about a global economic system transition, and time is obviously very critical. Now, when we think about where we need to head, you quoted some of the statistics up front. I think it's now quite healthy that more and more financiers, investors are leaning in and saying, look, we've got to go where the emissions are and not just the green investments. But to do that, you need a rigorous framework to say, what does good transition really look like in order for us to make sure we don't have unintended consequences of locking in infrastructure that can last decades and actually make us more carbon intensive. So I think that is absolutely critical, and there's a fair number of transition finance frameworks and so forth, but we need some harmonization around that, but it's not a one-size-fits-all. Coming back to your point around coal, when you think about emerging markets and developing economies, and particularly in Asia, where we are headquartered, there's new energy that's coming up rapidly, and you're still seeing some of that being met through coal because renewable energy and energy storage is still not readily accessible. And we need to therefore make the new energy definitely cleaner, but there's also a fair number of existing coal that is a very, very young fleet, 15 years or younger. And so that's locked in. So we need to bring the economic incentives in a way whereby we can actually incentivize the decommissioning of that faster. And that's where transition carbon credits can come in. well-designed frameworks that say if you decommission it faster, replace with clean, with additionality, without leakage, and certainly with permanence, then let's stack the carbon credits and make sure that we can actually bring the phase out in a much more accelerated way. And so stacking those financial mechanisms is absolutely important, but with clear integrity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think we'll have time to touch on it today, but carbon credits will obviously play an essential role in this low carbon transition. Mahmoud, I'm turning over to you now. In your role within the UN, what does a just transition look like for you? And what are your thoughts in the work that you've done on transition finance more specifically?
Right. It's great to be back again here. And fascinating discussions yesterday and today, and building on some of the issues raised before, and the excellent comments by Mercedes and Ms. Park. So let me take it first on this systems approach. If Temasek and the financial institutions are thinking of a system, governments and policymakers should do the same. So the policymakers here shouldn't really be suffering from leakage and gaps of data, gaps of knowledge, gaps of finance that may be sometimes bridged by costly debt, or gaps of implementation, because you may have the data and you may have the money, but you don't really have capacity, especially when it comes to localization. If I pick on the particular example of coal and phasing out, that was one of the most important deliverables or announcements, rather, by the Glasgow summit, the COP26. Phasing out coal from South Africa, phasing in renewables, and dealing with the social consequences. If you have a system in place, you need to think exactly in the opposite way in terms of priorities. You need to assess first the social impact, because here we are talking about people who could be impacted, labor opportunity that could be lost, assets that had been associated with them not just by the government or by the state, but the people. And then you consider the phasing in of renewables, because you need really the country to run on something dependable. And then the happy outcome of that will be the natural phasing out. The reason that these kinds of nice approaches didn't really work, despite the fact that the money was there, is basically the policy was not there. The system was not really speaking to each others in terms of components. And in many aspects of the work that we're seeing in the transition, that you cannot really go and challenge some of the values behind it. But when it comes to implementation and operationalization of these values, you don't really see systems of transitions speaking to system of government or budgets, or when you try to translate this at the big year of the indices, the nationally determined contributions, they are not aligned with any of that, not with the budget, not with the rest of the components. So better countries, when they are managed better, they can really get possible partnerships with what is offered in technical assistance and support, or can, in a good day, can have funding either from Temasek or HSBC with less risks than being perceived.
You're doing the moderator job for me. That was a perfect segue into the next segment, right? I think one of the big takeaways for me there is the private sector is essential to this, but the private sector can't do it alone. You need governments and vice versa. Mohamed, turning it over to you, let's talk about public-private partnerships, right? And the role and the experience that HSBC has in that area.
Yeah, thank you for having us here. Well, again, I mean, similar to the other panelists, when it comes to HSBC, we think catalyzing the new economy is vital for transition. Now, when we look at what's happening in the past 3.5 years, there is a great focus when it comes to financing existing solutions. Here I'm referring to solar, wind, batteries, and banks. To be honest, we are very well capitalized to help financing the new technologies as they emerge. The problem is, 35% of the emission reductions that we need to achieve by 2050 will come from technologies that are actually not yet at commercial scale. So there is no problem with the banking sector when it comes to having the capital in place. Again, a reference to His Excellency Majid, the previous panel, that is actually the role of Altera. When it comes to a given project here in the UAE, the sovereign is AA rated. If you go at the individual projects, there'll be investor grade projects. So there is no problem actually attracting FDIs, and the banking sector is there to help. The problem is, when it comes to projects in, say, Central Asia, when it comes to Africa. So a lot of risk need to be bridged by people like, the multilateral development banks and people like Altera, the geopolitical risk, the currency risk for banks like HSBC and others to come in and help. Now, we've been operating in this country for 70 plus years. Right, so we led the private-public sector joint venture for so many years. We started here in Abu Dhabi, so the IWPPs in Abu Dhabi, 9 of them. Actually, we were the sole advisor to government of Abu Dhabi on these IWPPs. What we did, we got international players to come in, so it's a 60-40 JV, and we provided long-term balance sheet, and we continue to do that.
And maybe elaborating more on partnerships, I know HSBC and Temasek have worked together before as well. Kyung-Ah, can you elaborate more on some of the climate partnerships that Temasek's been involved with?
Yeah, no, it's really been a privilege to work with HSBC. I mean, this agenda requires us to radically collaborate. Right? I talked about the value chain collaboration earlier, but it's also important to think about the different stages of capital. So we have quite a number of partnerships from kind of early stage with, for example, Breakthrough Energy at the venture. We established a new platform called Decarbonization Partners because there's a missing middle to take proven technology and really radically take it to scale and bring it down the cost curve, called Decarbonization Partners. And in the transition, we have a partnership with Brookfield to really transition incumbent industries. But when we also looked at the market opportunity out there, or the gap, talking about some of the blending that needs to happen and where we need to lean in. In Southeast Asia, there's many projects that are marginally bankable, where with a bit of elbow grease and some concessional capital that provides some de-risking, very acupuncture de-risking, you could actually finance it with mainstream financiers, investors coming in. So we formed a JV, a 50-50 JV called Pentagreen that is doing sustainable infrastructure debt financing. And it's partnering with the Singapore government on something called the Financing Asia's Transition Partnership, where the government is mobilizing $1 billion of concessional capital with the goal of crowding in and targeting $5 billion. And it's focused on 3 different areas: energy transition, green investment partnership, which is the marginally bankable, and then industrial transformation and decarbonization. And Pentagreen is the manager in that middle, that green investment partnership, to try to get marginally bankable projects to scale. And it's actually very important, and the role of Altera is another good example that was mentioned earlier, where the stacking of capital to try to get more of these technologies that may be proven, but yet because of either FX issues or because of credit risk issues and so forth, with a little bit of, again, elbow grease and that targeted concessional capital, you can unlock a lot more. And that's sort of where the catalytic opportunity is. The last point I'll mention is in the context of these collaborations. I think a lot of some of the things that you're talking about, where if we can harmonize more, even though I know this world is becoming increasingly more fragmented, capital and technology benefits from scale and liquidity. So the more harmonization we can do around whether it's frameworks, whether it's reporting, whether it's policy, I think the better off we are, because at the end of the day, greenhouse gas emissions is a global problem. It doesn't know any borders. And again, technology and capital benefits from scale and liquidity.
And standardization is essential as well, right? Like making sure all of those frameworks are aligned so that we can make sure that capital flows from A to B effectively.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And Kyung-Ah, you mentioned Southeast Asia. I want to turn it back to Mercedes now, and maybe if you could elaborate a little bit more on the work that you're doing in emerging markets. I know you mentioned Africa, but I'm sure there's other regions within the world that you guys are helping to catalyze that climate finance.
Sure. And also, following up on your point around collaboration, perhaps just to give you a bit of background on how we all came about with this whole vision of the Global Climate Finance Center. So we quickly find out during COP28, when we went and spoke to the private leaders, they felt that public institutions were just simply too slow, extremely bureaucratic, and their speed just simply didn't match the speed of commercial transactions. Now, on the other hand, when we spoke to the public leaders, they felt that private financial institutions did not understand the risks, particularly in emerging markets, and therefore, most of the time, they just simply decided to completely ignore this type of opportunity. So it became very clear very quickly that if we were serious, truly serious, around scaling climate finance, we had to focus on collaboration. And that's the whole idea of the Global Climate Finance Center, a platform not to compete, but to collaborate, not to delay, but to deliver. And in order to do so, we're focusing on, and it was also covered by the other speakers, regulatory frameworks, fit-for-purpose regulatory frameworks to mobilize capital, capacity and technical expertise, but also de-risking mechanisms. In terms of Africa and what we do, we like to highlight, and going back to the point around partnerships and the importance of collaboration between the private and the public sector, I think the Africa Green Investment Initiative is a great example. So this was launched during the Africa Climate Week under the leadership of the UAE Ministry of Foreign Affairs, together with a number of entities here in the UAE, such as, for example, Etihad Credit Insurance, Masdar, Amir Power, and others, working together hand in hand with Africa 50 on the ground. And again, the aim is to mobilize that 4.5 billion into clean energy projects in Africa by 2030. I think it will be very important going forward. I think there is great amount of work, but it's very much ad hoc and uncoordinated. So instead of just rebuilding or creating something new, let's bring each other's resources together to mobilize the agenda.
Yeah, and Mohamed, what about on HSBC side? What work are you doing to mobilize capital to emerging markets?
Well, GCFC, we are one of the founding partners. Pentagreen, I just wanted to actually comment on that. We are today with Pentagreen, actually, we are in Temasek and Cambodia, Thailand, Philippines. If any of those projects were actually presented to any commercial bank where you have to look at the commercial proposal, purely from return perspective and risk perspective, it would have been declined. Actually, wouldn't even reach the credit committee. So it's very, very important actually to have such initiatives in place. Now, when it comes to us here, we have deployed $6.5 billion last year, right? And these are and this is HSBC's balance sheet, and this is 32% higher than the previous year across various renewable projects. We've also actually led $1.2 billion of various activities in the capital market, whether it's green sukuk, sustainable linked transactions, and we continue to do that.
Great. Mahmoud, we've got a few minutes left here. I wanted to pivot very slightly and ask you about carbon border adjustment mechanisms. I've been in the Middle East for a few days now. That topic continues to come up, and the impact that could have on the Middle East and other markets around the world. What do you expect there?
Right. Three things that will shape the discussion this year, of course, in addition to what we are going to see in Belém and Brazil with the focus on nature and biodiversity as well. But carbon pricing, carbon credit markets, and CBAM. And it looks like one of those old movies when it is with a kind of an acronym that could really frighten someone. But if you are in any of these industries, aluminum, steel, fertilizers, cement, and if you are exporting them and others of other sectors to EU or the UK, you need to be prepared. You have less than 12 months for preparations, and we have only a few seconds to tell you what to do. WTO, you can go and complain. I can tell you, good luck with that, because you have to wait in a long queue until the evidence of harm is established. Then you may have friends in Brussels or London. Go and complain. You will wait on another queue. You may not get an answer, but again, try. There are some people who will claim that they will be helping you. Third, restructure in order to reduce emissions. If it's going to be costly, it's going to accelerate your phasing out plans, you may need to compare the cost of restructuring with the cost that you are going to be paying as fees to Europe or to the EU or the UK, and very soon it might be under a different name with the US. Fourth way to do it is establish some sort of understanding of your more affordable carbon market, could be a regional one or a national one. Fifth one, perhaps you learn something from India by having a good arrangement with the customs authority, pay your authority instead of paying the Europeans or the Brits. The number 6, I would say just pay the fees if it is not going to be that costly to you until you do the further of the restructuring that you do. But again, carbon pricing, carbon credit markets, and CBAMs are going to be dominating many of the discussions. Be prepared for that.
Absolutely. Well, we're unfortunately out of time here. We covered a lot, but if I were to take away kind of one big takeaway from this discussion, we've got 4 or 4.5 really impressive people on stage today, and I think they need all of your help in the audience, right? We can't do this in siloed different wings. We all need to collaborate to ensure that we can mobilize this capital appropriately, and the UAE and the Middle East more broadly is going to play a huge role here. So if everyone could please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you.